Great, I think we can get started now, and people can join throughout the program. So. Hi everyone, thank you so much for joining us. I'm Eileen Jeng Lynch, a curator of visual arts at Wave Hill. We're delighted to have Salvador Muñoz here with us today. I'm just going to provide a visual description of myself for any audience members who may be visually impaired. So I am an Asian American woman with dark brown hair, about shoulder length. I'm wearing dangling pink earrings, and I have white headphones on. And behind me is a virtual background of Salvador's vibrantly colored sculptural installation in the Sun Porch, which we are going to be discussing today. So before we begin, I would also like to do an accessibility check. Today we have a few options for participation. You can ask a question using the chat function or the Q&A function. For those dialing in, if you would like to ask a question, you can text 732-470-4428. As I mentioned, you can also ask questions in the Q&A section. Well, we may answer those during the conversation or towards the end of the program. During the Q&A section, you can also ask your question aloud. So if you raise your hand, we can call on you and unmute you. We are not providing ASL interpretation for this program, but we are using closed captioning through Zoom. If you like to start closed captions, please press the CC button at the bottom of your Zoom window. And right now, I'm also going to paste some shortcuts into the chat, keyboard shortcuts. I'd also like to continue by reading a land acknowledgement. We acknowledge the traditional, ancestral, unceded homelands of the Lenape, the Munsee, the Manatan, the Canarsie, the Matinacock, the Shinnecock, and other Indigenous nations. We respect that many Indigenous people continue to live and work on this land and recognize their ongoing contributions to the region. We also acknowledge the enslaved Africans whose labor built and developed the Northeast during the colonial era and beyond. And now I'd like to introduce Salvador Muñoz, our 2020 New York Community Trust Van Lier Fellow. Salvador draws on his identity as a third-generation Chicano, as well as his social practice, which focuses on queer people of color, to create this installation in the Sun Porch, highlighting lost cultural histories. Salvador has also had solo shows at Mayday Space in Brooklyn, Auxiliary Projects, also in Brooklyn, and Minen Gallery in Los Angeles, among others. Salvador has also exhibited at the Leslie Lohman Museum here in New York, Trestle Art Space in Brooklyn, and the Brooklyn Academy of Music. Salvador earned a BA from the University of California in Santa Barbara. Hi, Salvador. Thank you again for joining us.
Hi, Eileen. Thank you so much for having me and for that wonderful introduction. I felt very official and fancy. I'm going to start by giving a brief visual description of myself. So I am a Mexican-American or Chicano person, and I have big curly brown hair, and I am wearing gold eye makeup and big old gold hoop earrings. And behind me is a collection of my floral studies, which we will talk about later. Now, before Eileen and I jump into our conversation about my installation, I wanted to invite a dear friend of mine to open this program with a song. My friend Ecstasy is going to join us in just a moment, and they are a singer-songwriter with ranchera roots. Their work is dedicated to the earth, climate justice, and queer and trans people of color liberation through community-based strategies. And through music, they hope to create a space where we can connect with the earth and our true selves. So without further ado, I'm going to invite Ceci to come on camera and share some of their music with us.
Hey y'all, my name is Ceci. I use they and them pronouns and visual description. There's the sunlight coming in through the skylight. I am also Chicanx, brown with some curly hair and fade on the side, and wearing a black shirt with some colors on the inside. And y'all will see my mic set up in a second, but very honored to be here. And I guess before I start sharing the song, I'll share that for me, through like Salvador's work and thinking about Xochipilli, definitely wanting to choose a song that I think a lot of this phrase for poetry and Nahuatl, that's in Xochitencuicatel, which is flower and song together, is the name for poetry. And so hoping to share some of this, which I think for me speaks to this honorance or the reverence or the what we would sing, I believe, maybe to Xochipilli. So thank you, and thank you so much, Salvador, for having me, and congratulations.
Pido permiso cantar con todo mi corazón. Yo solo quiero cantar con todo mi corazón. Pido permiso cantar. Pido permiso cantar. Mi corazón. Con todo mi corazón. Yo solo quiero cantar. Con todo mi corazón. Con todo mi corazón. Permiso cantar. Pido permiso cantar. Mi corazón. Quiero cantar. Quiero cantar. Todo mi corazón. Todo mi corazón. Permiso cantar. Cantar mi corazón. Quiero cantar. Todo mi corazón. Permiso canto.
canto te sana. Es por ti que yo canto. Es por ti que yo canto. Sáname, sana mi tlali. 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 Pido permiso cantar con todo mi corazón. Yo solo quiero cantar con todo mi corazón. Thank you.
Ceci, that was beautiful. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for opening the space with that song. That was really special. I wanted to just chat a little bit about why I invited Ceci to open with this offering of a song. And first and foremost, right, as you all saw, Ceci is immensely talented, and their music is really powerful. And it's also a love letter to the earth, which feels like very resonant with my work that we're going to be talking about today. And then secondly, because this Van Lier Fellowship has been such an immense opportunity for me. And whenever I have these sort of opportunities, I think it's important for me to share that space with my community and make sure that it's not just me that's benefiting, but my community as well, because I am a product of my community. None of the work that I do is done individually. It's all community-based, and Ceci knows that better than most, having helped me a lot with this project and projects in the past. And so it was really a great honor to be able to share this space with you. Thank you for opening us with that offering, Ceci.
Yes, thank you so much, Ceci. That was a beautiful song. So now I'm going to screen share some images of Salvador's installation in the Sun Porch. One second. So Salvador, I'm wondering if you can tell us a little bit more about this installation.
Yeah, absolutely. So this, the installation is called A Sincere Gesture, and the central focus of the installation is the sculpture that you see before you. And this sculpture is a sculpture of Xochipilli, who is a Mexica deity that is strongly associated with flowers, but is also associated with art and music, as well as beauty and pleasure and sex and sexuality. And Xochipilli is also a dual deity, meaning that they have both a masculine and a feminine representation or physical embodiment. However, even in his male form or masculine presentation, Xochipilli is still strongly associated with the feminine. And all of this sort of points to a cultural understanding of queerness that has been erased or violently obfuscated. I like to say that when I'm feeling fancy or smart. But that has been really erased through the process of colonization and in service to colonization. So I wanted to sort of recreate this image of Xochipilli that through materials that would sort of render the associations with queerness explicitly visible rather than obscuring or hiding them. This sculpture is actually modeled after a statue of Xochipilli, which is on view at the Museum of Anthropology in Mexico City. And I think we have an image of what that looks like. And yeah, so this is the original sculpture that's in the collection of the Museum of Anthropology. And this is sort of what I used as my source material. So this statue is very small. It's about 3 feet tall. And my sculpture is actually 6 feet tall. So a little bit twice the size. And the reason for this is sort of twofold. The first being that the material that I'm working with, these artificial flowers, sort of necessitate that size in order to be able to recreate the intricate carvings on the statue. And then the other part of that is that it's really supposed to be like a celebration of queerness existing at this intersection of Chicano identity and queerness, or more broadly, BIPOC queer folks. And so I really wanted to honor, uplift, and celebrate that in a way that like takes up space unapologetically. And so those are sort of like the 2 reasons why it sort of landed at this scale.
Salvador, when did you last see this statue?
Yeah, so I saw this in January of 2020, like late January, early February. I had made a trip out there prior to starting my fellowship here at Wave Hill. And I was able to meet with the curator and take a lot of like detailed notes and pictures. And it really sort of like changed the direction of my project because there were certain materials that I was referencing that are now like sort of out of date or like presented from like an American or Western sort of concept. And so being able to take that trip and meet with the curator and get like the latest up-to-date information was really, really helpful.
And that was right before you started the fellowship.
Yeah,
the
yeah.
workspace.
So it was all like very fresh, yeah.
Mm-hmm. Great. And so can you talk to us more about the symbolisms here and unpack that for us?
Yeah, so that was part of like, I think if we go to the next slide, yeah, so here you can sort of see like the side-by-side comparison, and these photos are actually taken at like different angles. So it doesn't look as direct as like a one-to-one correlation that it actually is. But as I was getting deeper into this project, I sort of had to unpack the individual symbolism behind like each aspect or carving that was being recreated in the sculpture. So the first is sort of like the face, and you can see, I think on the next slide, or maybe even the next one, yeah. You can see that his face is sort of like frowning, and he has like this gold mask over his actual facial features. And that is because the statue that I'm referencing is described as wearing a mask of ecstasy. And so I wanted to sort of like recreate that. And I found these gold flowers. I actually sourced all of these flowers from LA, where I was able to buy them wholesale, which is much cheaper than buying them individually. And so I found these gold roses as I was looking at the wholesale shop, and immediately knew that I wanted to use that for this mask of ecstasy. You'll also see in these photos, particularly the one on the right, or the left, I'm not sure if you're seeing in your view or not, but one of them, you'll see that he has this gorgeous like chest plate on. And in mine, it's constructed from sequined fabric, and the teeth are constructed from foam cones that are covered in rhinestones. And this is meant to represent Siptali, or the crocodile of the earth. I'm sorry, I'm getting a question from Jack asking if the deity is indeed a him. So there are folks who would reference Xochipilli with gender neutral pronouns, so they and them, in either their masculine or their feminine form. And for me, it's sort of like a matter of like personal preference. I think I use he and him when I'm referring to the sculpture, because for me, what drew me to them was the feminine affinities in what would be perceived as a masculine body, which really resonates with how I move through the world and my lived experience, but also like I wouldn't deride anyone from calling them, referring to them as a they or them. I would like to think that they wouldn't mind either way. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
And then you had, when you're talking about the chest plate, there's the connection between the earth and the sun.
Yeah, so the chest plate is supposed to be from Siptali, the crocodile of the earth. And when the myth, to my understanding, thank you. The myth, to my understanding, is that when the earth was torn apart, a bat swooped down from the underworld and grabbed a piece of the skin. And the smell was so wretched that it flew it back to the underworld and abandoned it. And from that skin is where the first flowers bloomed. And so that's sort of the origin story of both flowers and Xochipilli. So it wears the animal skin on its chest and also on its ankles. And this was really fun to sort of explore the materiality of it and to make a sort of like a queer aestheticized version of this. I think it's one of like my favorite pieces on the overall piece. Yeah. Yeah, so there's a lot of intricate carvings all throughout the sculpture. And again, like my scholarship over this changed as I learned more about it. So originally I was under the impression that all of the flowers that were depicted on the sculpture were psychotropic flowers, right? So plants with psychotropic or hallucinogenic properties, right? And it's true that a lot of them are, but there's also a lot of them that aren't. And how it was explained to me is that Xochipilli is not just associated with psychotropic flowers. He is associated strongly with psychotropic flowers because they allowed the Mexica to commune with the gods, and that's why he does wear the mask of ecstasy. But he also is associated with any and all flowering plant life. And so if you scroll, so this is sort of his arm pictured on the statue. And if you scroll to the next image, you can see my recreation of it. And this is actually supposed to be a dahlia, which are also like very prominent within Mexican culture for a variety of reasons. And so there's a mix of both psychotropic plants and regular flowers that are of significance. And I think that something that was really interesting to me is that a lot of like, I've seen other artists like interact with Xochipilli as like a concept. And there does tend to be a focus on like the psychoactive elements of it. And I don't want to like knock anybody else's like interpretation or work. But I think what was interesting to me was one of the things that I learned when I was at the museum is that Xochipilli was also like a temperate god, so he would punish folks for overindulging with things like hangovers or for being too promiscuous. And so there's this element of like of reverence that I think sort of gets lost when you're only focusing on the psychoactive elements of the deity.
Salvador, you touched a lot upon, you've learning a lot about the background of the statue of Xochipilli. And I think even in presenting this exhibition, there have been a lot of learnings in general. And so you had mentioned these different interpretations of history, like the focus on the psychoactive plants versus the other flora that is still pronounced, but maybe hasn't been such highlighted, or even you mentioned Xochipilli as a Mexica deity. And I know there's some, maybe there could be some misunderstanding between like Mexica versus Mexican. So I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit more about that, because that, I feel like the Mexica culture has also been more buried or lost, or forgotten through the years. And so you've been highlighting these obfuscated histories.
Yeah, I think so for me it was really important to stick to Mexica because it was how that group and that region referred to themselves. Aztec was sort of like a later anthropological like term that was developed. And so it was really important for me to sort of like honor that history. And it also was directly like pulled from the source material that I was working with. And like at the Museum of Anthropology, right, it's the Mexica wing, it's not the Aztec wing, right? And so I think that like I knew that like presenting this in sort of like American, particularly like in the Northeast like context, there would be sort of like a little confusion and a bit of a learning curve, but it was important for me to sort of like stay true to that and also stay specific with it, right? Because we also speak about like the Nahuatl speaking people, which is the Mexica would fall under, but they're not sort of like synonymous. And so I wanted to make sure that like we weren't presenting it as such, because there is sort of like this homogenization that tends to happen among indigenous cultures within Mexico. And so I think that it was really important for me to sort of like not, as much as possible, to not contribute to that. And then I also think it's important to acknowledge, right, like the anti-indigenous like sentiment that is pervasive like in Mexico, because right, like it's sort of like a privilege for me to be able to sort of like theorize about these things, and to not have to suffer like the negative impacts that are ongoing within Mexico. And it's such like a which we see like in the US as well, right, where we mythologize like indigenous folks, but in reality, like they're still there, they're still like existing and thriving, despite messed up politics around like water rights and land use, etc. So I think it's important, and I would be remiss to sort of like not acknowledge like my own like privilege in being able to engage in this artwork in this way.
Did that contribute to the large scale size of this piece as well?
Absolutely, yeah. Yeah.
I think we can move on to a few more details.
Yeah.
On the statue.
So this is on the leg, and it was I'm gonna like butcher this name because I think it's Latin, but it's the Siniquichi plant, and the dots are actually the stamen, and this is one that is sort of that is a little psychoactive, but not like heavily, at least to my understanding. It's more closely related to sort of tobacco nicotine. Yeah, but it's like a bellflower shaped plant. And on this sculpture, made it out of yellow roses. And I think that they worked really well. Yeah, here we go. I think that they worked really well to sort of like recreate the stamen. And it's kind of like a halfway point between like a real representation and like the very cute like dots. And then the one on the right is, I believe, called like a red monkey hand, which is sort of why I chose the lilies to sort of make the bellflower shape, because they have those prominent stamens in them, and the monkey hand is all stamen. That's sort of its appeal. But I do want to sort of like acknowledge that like for a lot of these like plants that I'm identifying, it's not like 100%. It's sort of like best guess or best like scholarship or theory on it. So that is sort of both like a hindrance and also like gave me like a lot of room to sort of play around with the colors and with the different shades and setups. So.
Sure. I mean, you are showing us a more like one-to-one, you know, what's on the sculpture versus what your interpretation, but it's still a very, you know, artistic and loose interpretation of the piece.
Exactly. Yeah. It's like my interpretation of somebody's best guess of their hypothesis of what this could maybe possibly be. So this is sort of the base. And this is obviously a bigger flower than any of the others. And it's also believed to be either a dahlia or like a marigold. And so when I recreated this on the sculpture, I knew that I wanted it to be like very big, very vibrant, and very colorful. And I was pretty happy with how it came out. And then, so you'll notice on the base, if you go back one really quickly, you'll notice on the base at the top is lined with these little concentric circles. And the original research that I had done had identified these as like mushrooms, like magic mushrooms. And when I spoke with the curator, she actually corrected that they're representative of tonali, which is, and the more traditional configuration is the four together that you see on either side of the dahlias. But this is sort of, it's life force. It's like the spark of life that's in all like living beings, that's breathed into you, and it's very fiery. Yeah, so I chose to make it out of like gold and red to sort of connote those fiery like origins. And then additionally, like the bottom like swirls that you'll see are representative of like life cycles. And again, like Xochipilli being like a solar deity is very connected to life, and you know, flowers are life-giving. They come from the sun. So there's a lot of like really interesting connections there.
I don't think we could see it in this image, but in parts of the sculpture, you have some LED lights. And so is that also symbolic of life, or this fire that's burning?
Yeah, I think it's on the next slide. Yeah, so on the back, you can sort of see the tonali, which are the four circles. And then to the left of them, you'll see what are called papali, and they're four blocks, and they're described as containing every color under the sun. And so I had originally tried to recreate these out of prisms, but they wouldn't hang on as well. So I used this sort of like reflective fabric instead that I think works really well. It's hard to see in this picture, but when the sun shines directly on them, you can sort of see all the colors like reflected, and it looks like really nice.
We actually noticed that yesterday when the sun was shining on it and it was reflecting all the various colors. And so we weren't sure if it was within the material, if it was also reflective of all the other vibrant colors that are.
Yeah, I think it's a little bit of both. And I was really happy with how that turned out because the sun has to hit it like just right to be able to see all those colors. But when it does, like it's pretty magical. And then you did mention the LED lights. So the sculpture is actually, the statue that I'm referencing, right, is made from a volcanic rock. And it's actually like a reddish tint. Like, I don't think that my pictures really do like it justice, but it has like a very like reddish tint under it. And when I went to visit the sculpture at the museum, I was instructed to run my hands over it, not touching it, but just like on top of it, to see if I could feel sort of like the heat or the energy that it was releasing. And at first I was like, oh, okay, I'm sure, like I'll try it. But I really did feel like the pulse, like that was sort of like coming from it. And so I really wanted to be able to sort of recreate that with my sculpture. And I found that the way that I was able to do that was by using these LED lights that sort of like pulse throughout the sculpture. And you can't really see them unless you're like paying attention or sitting if the light hits it just right. But when you do, it sort of adds like this extra dimension to it.
It's very subtle. So when I'm looking at your sculpture, every now and then I'll see the light pulse. But every time I visit your sculpture, I find something new because there's so many different elements to it.
Yeah, thank you.
And then here, oh, you can see the LED light here in the middle, but they're all throughout the sculpture. And so this is an image that Madeline took, and it was one of the stormy days. And so the light was pretty dim, but it kind of created this halo around your sculpture, you know, through the feathers. And it has this, you know, this connotation, this idea of spirituality, you know, connected to it, especially in this image. I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about that.
Yeah, I actually love like this image. When you sent it to me, I immediately loved it. And yeah, it does sort of feel like spiritual and like glowing. And that's sort of like what I was like hoping would happen, both with like the LED lights, but also with the lighting. I think one of the great, I've taken like a lot of liberties with this project in terms of like color choice and for the different flowers. But one thing that is sort of remains true is that the headdress is actually as used pink stork feathers. Or he's described as having like bright pink stork feathers. So it was really special that even before I knew that, I was leaning towards making the feathers like this bright pink. So it just sort of like felt like sort of a reinforcement of like the line of inquiry that I was pursuing. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And then your installation continues to change. And so you've added these dried herbs now at the bottom. On the floor at the base of the sculpture, almost seeming like you're paying homage to the deity. And I wonder if you can talk more about this element of your installation.
Yeah, absolutely. So this was sort of born, as you know, I started this project during the winter workspace, which was in February of 2020. And then by mid-March, we were interrupted by the pandemic. And that sort of made me reevaluate like how I was like approaching the project. And as I said in the beginning, like it's really important for me to sort of leverage whatever opportunities that I'm given to sort of bring back something to or for my community. And when the pandemic hit, I sort of like returned to gardening as like, not just as like, you know, a hobby, but also as like a resource to sort of like help sustain myself. And I realized that like I wanted to sort of take advantage of the natural stuff that Wave Hill had to offer. So these are flowers that were gathered from Wave Hill throughout the exhibition and laid in front of the sculpture, almost like an offering. Yeah, and they'll actually be used in a workshop on Sunday for QD BIPOC folks to sort of learn about the herbs and walk away with some medicinal herbs that'll be culled from this installation. And that's being led by a QD BIPOC herbal farming collective, of which Ecstasy is a part. And that'll be this Sunday at 2. So if you are interested and available, you can register at Wave Hill's website, and I'd love to see you all there. And I'm really excited to be able to share this platform with the Herbalism Collective, because they're folks who I've known for years now, and being able to, they've worked on this project for so long, and being able to sort of pull out some of their expertise and bring them into this project feels like really special to me.
Definitely, I'm looking forward to this gathering centering on wellness and these herbal remedies. And so adjacent to your installation is one by Kamari Carter. And we would like to bring, hello Kamari in as a special guest and have you in dialogue. So I'm going to first show a couple of slides of Kamari's installation. So it's called Rekindle. So here's one view, and here is the next view. So Kamari, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
And in a previous conversation, you had mentioned the term radical empathy. And I believe that's something that both of your installations and your practice in general are doing. And I'm wondering if you would both like to elaborate a little bit more on that.
Definitely. I can start by I think I was the one that brought up the term. So yes. I can start by just kind of addressing it a little bit. I would like to define radical empathy as a thing that is seen and or that is experienced that enables you to understand a situation as empathetically as you can by nearly going through it yourself. And I would like to think that the installation that I have done in conjunction with the conversation of the space and the sculpture that Sal has done give you the opportunity to kind of sit and bask in both the idea, the materials, the story, and the homage to a thing, i.e. in Sal's case, a deity, in a way that gives you the opportunity, if you choose to further engage with it yourself, be a part of that thing, to be a part of that history, to be a part of that lineage, to learn and expand and think about things in a more critical way. And that's kind of an approach to my practice that I like to think about quite often. So that was kind of why I brought it up when we had that previous conversation.
And Salvador, would you like to touch upon that?
Yeah, I think that like mine is a little like inverse, where first and foremost, like I'm making my work like for my community, right? To be able to like see themselves sort of like reflected in this way. And then like the sort of like expansion of like radical like empathy from sort of like the folks from outside of the community sort of is like the secondary like goal. But I think that like to Kamari's point, right? radical empathy has to start with the self, right? Like you have to give yourself the grace that you're trying to extend to others. And so I definitely think that they're like in dialogue with each other, right? And it's been really great to see some of like the youth's like reaction to the work. And I've gotten a chance to interact with a few folks while I've been here. And yeah, definitely.
I mean, I'm wondering, Salvador, and Kamara, what do you hope, in addition to that, for the audience to take away? Because I guess everyone's coming to your work from a different perspective and lived experience.
Yeah. It might be a little onanistic to say, but I personally like a little bit of a gut punch when people experience my work in a way that is an extension of empathy, but also in a way that leaves you feeling or thinking differently, and also leaves you with something. I've definitely been in the space talking to a friend or a colleague, and somebody has stepped in, and the first thing that they say is like, "Hangman, huh?" And for me, that's exactly what I want people to kind of actualize as they step into the space, is to think about, oh, there's this game that we used to play as children that has this really heinous history. What's all that about? And to leave thinking more critically about that thing and about that lineage and about that history once again. So I'm hoping that that empathy is extended, but at the same time that it leaves someone with something, almost in a way that it is imprinted. But hopefully in that imprint, it helps them to critically move forward in a way that the next time that they have a conversation about something like that, or that they see something similar, they can advance the way that they thought about it. They don't have to think like, oh, this is the first time that I've seen something like that. But, oh, interestingly enough, I just saw an exhibition that was, hopefully that's kind of what they leave with.
Totally. I think for me, I think what I hope like folks leave with, whether like they are, sort of like the target audience or not, but is like an understanding of like queerness as divine, and queerness as like an ancestral like legacy, and that, we've sort of lost, but can return to. Yeah.
Wonderful. Thank you both for sharing that. And I'm wondering, what was the installation process like for you both? It's exciting to have the project come to fruition. It's been a long time in the works. Salvador, for you, over a year and a half, and Kumar, for you, almost a year. And how was it working alongside each other, even during this time?
Yeah, install was a lot of fun with Sal. I would say it was a hectic and somewhat warm day, but it was fun to have like my gallows sculpture kind of brought in, and Sal's sculpture brought in a series of pieces of boxes, trying to make sure that it fits through the right window and stuff like that. It was a lot of fun. I definitely enjoyed the setup and the orientation and the install process. And yeah, one thing that we kind of talk about a lot is how my room and my space has extremely earthy tones, and the color palette is very, very subtle, and how Sal's sculpture just lights up the entire room because it's as colorful as it is. And I felt like that dichotomy was kind of nice. I have no idea how intentional you were thinking about that, Eileen, but it was, it works very well.
Yeah, I agree. It's interesting because that was the first time that Kamari and I had met in person, was when we were actually like installing, and we had of course like chatted on like Zoom before, and it was the first time we really met in person. So it was interesting, like just like that level. And then as we were installing, it was like really interesting to see like what our priorities like were, and like what we were like worried about versus like what was like, like Kamari's stuff fit straight through the door, so getting it inside was a lot less of a concern as opposed to mine, which shout out to the amazing art handlers who worked it like through a window or two. And and yeah, there's such like a stark like contrast between like the presence and absence of the figure, between like the color palettes that we're working from, that it feels like very like distinct shows, but they're still like in conversation with each other, which like is, I know isn't easy from like a curatorial perspective, but comes together like very nice. So yeah.
I wonder if you have any questions for each other.
Yeah, I think so there's this interesting like conversation going on with both of our work where we're re-examining like histories, right? And looking to tell you know, histories that may have been erased or obfuscated or distorted over time, right? And I'm curious to know like sort of how you handle like the concept of like truth within this work, or what you would say to somebody who sort of like disagrees with your version of history.
Sure. Yeah, we kind of talked about it a little bit, but truth is a very difficult thing because there are, you know, there's an anecdotal truth and an axiom, you know, that are sometimes at odds with each other. But it's kind of hard to tell a story because most stories are done and told through oral histories. And, you know, from time to time, there are a lot of stories that are done through like text-based formats. But when it comes to people of color, when it comes to BIPOC people, a lot of the early work that like specifically we are working with does seem pretty opaque and almost was intentionally obfuscated. So it's kind of difficult digging some of that stuff up and, you know, having your head to the ground when it comes to the research. But I would say that in both of our practices, I think that there is a lot of intentionality that's paid attention to making sure that there's a lot of accuracy in the story, because we want to ensure that what we are representing and presenting is not continuing to perpetuate any sense of erasure, but if only presenting the work as authentically as possible whilst still uplifting the very people or things that we're speaking about, which is much easier said than done. But I think that we both try our best to pay attention to doing that as best we can. So yeah, if anyone disagrees with my sense of truth, I'm happy to challenge because I spent many months researching, so.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, it brings up that the larger question of what is truth?
Totally.
What is history? You know, based on whose perspective? So thank you both for creating such thought-provoking installations.
Thank you for having us.
I'm wondering now if we can open it up to the audience. Or I'm sorry, Salvador, I wanted to ask if you, wanted to talk further about the notion of truth before we open it up.
Oh, no, I think like Kamari sort of like hit the nail on the head. Yeah, I also sort of feel like, like what is truth, right? And like, I'm sure that there are people who would like disagree with like my interpretation or analysis of like this, and that's like, fine, you're entitled to like your wrong opinion, but you know, debate your mom, not me. But yeah, I do think that there is like, I think that like the question of like truth, right, is so murky, especially in 2021, right? When we've lived through the era of like fake news.
But now I feel like there's more questioning of it, you know, so we can get the whole story rather than parts of it.
Absolutely.
So Salvador, we have a question from Chris in the audience about if you can talk more about the significance of the Dahlias.
Yeah, I saw that question and I have like theories, but I don't want to like state like the wrong thing. So I don't want to like misspeak. Sorry. But yeah, they're very like culturally significant still like to this day, and appear at like a lot of like celebrations, and
And I also wanted to read some comments. Jesse said, pulsing lame glitter, even the use of platform has me thinking about the club as a space of queer communion within this context.
Totally, yeah. I'm not a club girl anymore. I've aged out of that scene, but there was definitely a period when I was like constructing everything, especially like the base, where I would be like physically on top of the base, like next to the figure, like installing things. And from that perspective, it reminded me a lot of like Felix Gonzalez Torres's like platforms, like that he made. So there's definitely yeah, a bit of a that connotation as well. Yeah, and it is sort of like difficult to sort of separate like this extravagant like queer aesthetic from like the club aesthetic. So I totally like see and like and hear like those connections for sure.
Yeah, definitely. And is the statue of Xochipilli on, is it a pedestal or platform? Like how does that, yeah, and then your sculpture is on the ground, so how does
Yeah, so in the museum, it's presented on a platform. Yeah, like it's larger than a pedestal, so I guess it would be a platform, but it brings the sculpture up to eye height. But for me, because it was so large, it didn't really necessitate a platform. We did talk a little bit about putting it on like a pedestal, but we ultimately decided that it looked best on the ground. Yeah. Yeah. And then, yeah, I think the actual sculpture at the museum is like two pieces with the figure and the base.
And then we have more than a question than a comment from the audience from Blanca. Kamari and Salvador, what a pleasure listening to you speak about your work and look forward to seeing it up close soon. Congratulations.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So I think that is a nice way to wrap up unless anyone has any more questions for either Salvador or Kamari. But we do want to encourage you, if you're available on Sunday, to attend Salvador's Convening a Sincere Gesture, a program led by the QT BIPOC Collective of Herbal Practitioners. That is on site from 2 to 3 p.m. in the Sun Porch. And then I wanted to mention our upcoming other Sunroom Meet the Artist talks with 2021 Van Lier Fellows, Jake Brush and Catherine Miranda. That will take place on site in October 2nd at 2 p.m. I know that's a little bit of ways, but wanted to put it on everyone's radar. So please come on by to see the shows if you haven't already. Just want to thank Ceci, Salvador, Kamari, Jesse, and Gabriel, and everyone for tuning in to this program.
Thanks everyone for coming.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.